Good morning, students. Hope you are well and safe. This lecture is for April 8th or 9th, depending on which U.S. history class you're in. As we pick up with the Truman administration, by 1952, his administration had amassed a huge number of liabilities. Number one was the Korean conflict, and that was a bloody stalemate. You had price controls at home, and you had corruption of military lobbyists who had rigged military contracts. And so all of these things really hurt him, as well as corruption within several federal agencies, and wondering if the president would ever get this cleared up. So, Republicans come along and claim it is a time for change. Now, the new presidential candidate is interesting. His name is Dwight Eisenhower. He was actually the Allied commander of D-Day and the Allied invasion of Europe to defeat Germany. Probably the most popular individual in all the United States at that point in time in history. And quite honestly, both political parties tried to get Eisenhower to run for them. And Eisenhower finally decided that he would run as a Republican, but he wanted to be a moderate Republican. His decision to run was wildly popular. In fact, his campaign slogan was simply, "I like Ike." Ike being a shortened nickname for him. He had one goal, one major goal. Having seen all the effects of World War II, he realized the United States could not retreat back into isolationism. That would be a very, very dangerous thing. And so the Republican platform is going to say that the Democratic emphasis on containing communism was negative, futile, misguided, and a form of appeasement. And so you have two contrasting personalities. Eisenhower, the man of moderation, Adlai Stevenson, somebody that was hardly known outside of his own state. And they did not want someone who would imitate Truman. And Stevenson was just quite honestly outmatched. Now, 1952 election was unique because it was the first time that television was used to campaign from. Now, today, that's a common thing. But in 1952, it was new and innovative. And Eisenhower triumphed with a landslide. And for the first time in more than a century, the solid Democratic South was broken into a two-party system. In fact, Tennessee went Republican instead of Democrat that year. People liked Eisenhower's folksy charm, but they realized here was a battle-tested individual who could make the tough decisions if they had to be tough. Now, congressional elections 2 years later are going to weaken the Republican grip on Congress, but for a time it was there. Eisenhower was the first professional soldier career to be elected president since U.S. Grant. He was a man of war who wanted peace more than anything. He saw no need to dismantle all the Democrats' New Deal and Fair Deal programs. All he wanted to do was end the excesses that had resulted from 20 years of Democratic control of the White House. Eisenhower was a unifier. He inspired trust. He was willing to compromise, and he tried to avoid confrontation. The election was over his popularity, not issues. And for the most part, his presidency was almost uneventful. So he did seek to reduce defense spending, lower taxes, weaken typical Republican government regulation of business, and restore power to states. His cabinet was dominated, though, by wealthy businessmen. And as a middle-of-the-road president, in some respects, he will actually expand some of the New Deal programs. Two big federal government projects will be underway. Number one, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and probably the thing Eisenhower is most remembered for, the interstate highway system. Eisenhower had seen the Autobahn in Germany, and he realized having a road where we can move military personnel if we need to without having to go through cities and other things would be very, very important. So the interstate highway system is going to be his baby. And beginning in 1956, this is exactly what he will begin. And it is going to be a huge project. It will create new jobs. It will stimulate the economy. It's going to spur tourism. The hotel, motel industry is going to grow. Long-haul trucking industries are going to grow. And so literally the interstate highway system is going to change how people traveled, what people did in this world. And by 1948, after we're through with the war, we're going to find that about 60% of families in America owned a car. By 1955, it is going to be 90%. And to a great extent, more and more families are going to have two. So post-World War II is definitely going to be what we can call the age of the automobile. In the 50s, automobiles were more than a form of transportation. They provided social status and personal freedom. Life centered around the car. And literally, Americans will begin a love affair with the automobile. The car is going to transform social behavior. It is going to prompt the creation of, quote, convenience stores, drive-in movies, and fast food restaurants. And it is going to be part of the standard consumer package, and it will alter the landscape of America forever. If you have your textbook, there's an interesting picture in there of an early McDonald's restaurant with the advertisement that a hamburger was 15 cents. Yep. Prices have changed a lot, students, since the 1950s. But fast food places, these little quick dine places, and so on. All of this is going to be a part of the changing landscape that occurs in the United States in the 1950s. McCarthy, that we talked about in our last lecture, and his stirring up of the communism and so on, he's going to pretty much die away, and ultimately in 1954 he will actually be condemned by the Senate because of his recklessness. There was a brief post-war recession, 1945-46, but the economy turned around quickly and soared to record heights as businesses shift from wartime production to construction of new housing and a mass array of production of consumer goods. In fact, by 1953, the U.S. was producing 2/3 of the world's manufactured goods. Now let's realize in 1941 we were still struggling from a depression. So in less than 10 years, look what we are doing. Of course, realize, as I told you, during World War II, we're going to wind up outproducing everyone. And that incentive and initiative is going to keep right on going. Europe's still in ruins. Japan is in ruins. Most of the world has suffered some kind of damage, and so the U.S. is providing goods for the world. Of course, the Korean War, still a problem, and a lot of people are very, very weary of that war as Eisenhower becomes the president. But in the late 40s and early 50s, the superior productivity of American industry is going to contribute to tremendous economic growth in the United States. But this would be the last decade of the industrial age, as manufacturing will begin to decline toward the end of the decade. So the 50s are going to be a boom, but they're also going to bring about a bust afterwards. Of course, lack of foreign competition helps a whole lot. So America is able to really, really exceed in production of world goods. And you've got 4 years of war. You've got a lot of unleashing of pent-up consumer demand, and people are ready to, on one hand, go out and buy and spend. But a thought, with all of this boom going on, most businesses were still closed on Sunday. Few restaurants, very few service stations. You know, if you were traveling and you were going to be driving on Sunday, you got your gas on Saturday because you might not find it on Sunday. And this is going to be a sign of especially the early 50s. The U.S. is going to have a very serious religious bend. Of course, during the war, people were praying and people were going to churches, wishing for the best, and so on. And so that continues in the post-war. Many people believe God gave the Allies the victory, and they sought to honor God in many, many ways. In fact, the phrase "under God" will actually be added to our Pledge of Allegiance. And all of that was the belief in how much God had helped the United States in the course of the war. Between 47 and 1960, the average income for the working class increased by as much as it had in the previous 50 years. More and more blue-collar Americans, especially automotive and steel workers, had actually moved into the middle class. But by 56, white-collar workers were outnumbering the blue-collar workers. So another significant change. Early on, America was strongly agricultural. And then by the late 19th century, America changes from primarily agricultural to industrial. And now in 1956, we move from primarily industrial to primarily white-collar type working. So changes are occurring, and they are occurring more quickly. Americans had money to spend in the 50s, and they did so. It was a consumer culture. And the measure of freedom was the ability to gratify your desires. And of course, with the TV coming out, new methods of advertisement came out, and people were told about all of these new products that they really, really needed. The first credit card will appear in 1949, and during the 50s, as a result of all of this, personal indebtedness will double. House, that was the biggie. After the war, that was what most people wanted. In fact, a house of your own is pretty much wrapped up and encapsulates the idea of the American dream. And let's think about these new homes that are being built. They had refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, electric mixers, carving knives. Some of them even had shoe polishers within them. And the interest rates on these credit cards encouraged people to buy these products by the use of that card and make, of course, monthly payments on them. As more and more televisions come out, watching it is going to actually displace the radio. And it will cut into movie attendance as a very popular way for Americans to spend free time. Now understand, most of the television programs in the 50s presented a very idealized lifestyle. For example, programs where people were married. Number one, if it showed a bedroom scene, and that was quite often very, very rarely done, if a bedroom scene was shown, it was usually with the husband and wife having separate beds. Idealized. Women did their housework with their jewelry on, with makeup, in dresses, and in high heels. Men would come home from their white-collar jobs with their coat and tie on, and they might unbutton their coat, but they remained dressed through dinner. So very idealized. I dare say none of us do housework in some of our finest dress, and yet that's how it was presented in the 50s. And of course, because of the popularity of television, it obviously attracted the advertisers, and they're going to tell you all of these things you need and all of these things you must have if you're going to be able to live life in America. And by the end of the decade, 9 out of 10 American homes will have a television. Okay, as I mentioned in the last lecture, we were talking about the GI Bill, and the GI Bill was really, really an important boost to what the American soldiers had done. It provided unemployment pay for up to a year. GIs got preference in hiring jobs, loans for constructions and starting business was easier to get, access to government hospitals, and even subsidies for education. And this, again, like the Marshall Plan that we talked about in the last lecture, will become one of the most successful federal programs ever brought into being. And yet most of your colleges and universities will remain racially segregated. So we have the suburbs building up, and again, these remain lily white as we go through the decade of the 50s. The suburbs, though, are going to attract. And as air conditioning becomes more and more common, the Sun Belt states, the Deep South, are going to draw individuals, and they are going to grow. Suburbia is going to meet an affordable need in that it allows a degree of personal freedom and security, but within commuting distance of the cities. So it is going to become kind of a mecca of freedom. And during the 50s, the suburbs will grow 6 times as fast as the cities do. And by 1970, more people will live in suburbs than live in the cities. Federal tax codes are going to favor homeowners over renters, and local governments will pay for infrastructure like roads, water, sewer lines, fire and police protection that go on in these communities. And as I said, these are going to be, for the most part, lily white communities. There are racial boundaries, as basically the flee to the suburbs is white flight. Getting out of the cities and getting to where whites can be entitled as they feel. By 1960, for example, only about 5% of African Americans will actually live in the suburbs at all. So what happens? Well, a lot of Southern blacks are going to move to the urban North, Midwest, and West, and this will be much more true after World War II than it was even after World War I. And by 1960, more blacks will be living in urban areas than were living in rural areas as they move into these northern cities. But sadly, for a lot of them moving into these cities, they're going to wind up living in the less desirable parts of the cities and will wind up dwelling in what will be called ghettos. So the racial attitudes that existed in the South haven't really gone anywhere. They exist in the North, and through communities throughout the nation. And public housing was basically rejected as being a part of the suburbs at that time. So again, we're pushing the African Americans toward the cities. We're pushing the whites out away from the cities. And yet, many African Americans will find life in the North or in the West a little more preferable than it was in the Deep South with the Jim Crow laws still in place. But as African Americans are on the move, so are Hispanics as well. But non-whites are going to remain in the manual and unskilled jobs for the most part. Well, what about women? Well, there are going to be popular magazines coming along, and middle-class women are going to be attacked, if you will, with this is what you're supposed to be, this is how you're supposed to raise your children, this is what home is supposed to be like, and of course, you've got to have this particular appliance to make your life so much better. And so there were ideal images of the happy homemaker and the middle-class suburban life as being the ideal of the world. By the way, after World War II, getting married during high school or while in college became a norm. So there were a lot of younger marriages taking place. Female college students are able to take courses that would prepare them for home life. And obviously, the celebration of marriage and motherhood and culture and mass media promoted the idea that getting a husband was far more important for a young woman than earning a college degree. But during the 50s beginning, many women did work outside the home, but it was usually a necessity. They were either in clerical or service positions as well. And there was a baby boom after World War II, as you could expect. And your textbook makes it very clear that the decade was an ideal time to be a child. People felt a sense of safety. Young people weren't afraid to go to school. There weren't metal detectors at schools. There weren't mass shootings taking place at school. Children could get out and play in the yard, and they weren't afraid of being kidnapped and murdered by strangers. So it was a different world than the world in which we live today. It was a world where, may we say, in some respects, people were gentler and kinder. Now, that's not to say there was no crime, but it is to say that children were not so much caught up in those things as they tend to be today. The adolescents are going to drive the economy, and of course, young people. One of the rites of passage in the 50s and then into the 60s and onward is going to be when you get 16 years old, you're able to get your own automobile. And again, this to a great extent is going to be a status symbol for young people in that period of time. Now, as we talk about the religious boom in the United States, that not necessarily is true in Europe. Europeans are sour on the notion of religion, and it has been in a continual free fall, really beginning with World War I and going through World War II. And so that has changed. The nation in the 50s will develop what is called a Judeo-Christian heritage, and the highest percentage of Americans in history will be attending church services. The sale of Bibles will soar. In fact, books will soar. Movies, songs with religious themes. By the way, most of your movies that were presented that had Christian themes and so on were positive in the way in which they presented Christianity, unlike much of what we see today. And the Cold War, communism actually provided a stimulant for Christianity because Americans knew communism demands no religion, atheistic religion, and so this was a way Americans could counter that. So quite interesting what is going to take place. Eisenhower will actually begin his inaugural address with a prayer, about a 7-minute long prayer. So that is a most interesting way for a president to begin. And the general idea or theme of America, motto, will become, "In God we trust." You see that on some of the first responder vehicles, even in our own community, especially many of the police cars. So people thought about God quite a bit. And the contrast, of course, is a godly America versus a godless Soviet Union. And religion is going to do quite well. But in spite of religion's wellness, there is going to be a growing period of anxiety, dissent, and even diversity. And so as America develops what we call a throwaway culture of consumption and so on, poverty is still going to affect nearly half of the African American population, compared to about 1/4 of the white population. The promised land of the North was anything but perfect. African Americans are going to run into racial prejudice and discrimination in the workplace, hiring, in housing, schools, and even in social life. And there are going to be many people who are very alarmed by this American desire to worship almost consumerism. And a growing number of writers are going to question the complacency and prosperity of American way of life. They will view the decade as becoming more and more moral complacent and blind conformity. In other words, everyone is trying to become alike. And the most enduring novels of the period themed on an individual's struggle for survival amid the forces of mass society. And so, prosperity, discrepancy, a lot of contradictions going on in the 50s, and out of that, we have a protest group that is going to begin. It is going to be writers, poets, painters, musicians who reject the materialism of the culture, and they are going to become known as beats. They are basically people without a major cause. They were cultural outlaws. They rebelled against convention, and they wanted to live lives of risk and originality, fueled by spontaneity and energy. And of course, some of this will come out in movies. You'll have actors taking tremendous risks in movies, racing automobiles toward the end of a cliff to see who will be the last one to stop, and things of this nature. So they celebrated impulsive action while seeking to find pleasure in areas of experimentation, including both sex and drugs. They were generally undisciplined, often unkempt. They coined their own types of languages and really didn't care if folks liked them at all. And then, in the 50s, along comes a new genre of music. And quite honestly, when this new genre of music comes into being, there are older people who are bound and determined that life in the United States is going to be completely destroyed. That this music was the music of Satan himself, and it would ruin America. It is called rock and roll. It's interesting. One of the early leaders, Elvis Presley, raised near Memphis, had jazz, blues, and bluegrass as a part of his background. And all of these things will come to play and influence him as he begins to be one of the developers of rock and roll music. Buddy Holly will be another one. And older people will look at this and think that anyone who embraces rock and roll is some kind of delinquent. And that, again, they are going to destroy the country. Well, many black artists begin to come out. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Ray Charles, and others. And their music bridges the gap between black and white. And again, there are going to be a lot of individuals who have tremendous problems with this. These people are destroying the younger culture. And so rock and roll, ultimately Motown, and other genres of music are going to come out. And quite honestly, in the mid-50s, Elvis Presley is going to be the most popular musician in American history. Rock and roll is going to flourish, and it is going to become a part of American culture, even as it still exists today. Of course, being highly prejudiced, and I think I can express my prejudice here, all the great music in history was written during the 1960s and early 70s. But rock and roll music will deal with so many amazing themes. You'll have songs about boy and girl relationships. You'll have songs about surfing that have become very popular. You'll have songs about cars and different kinds of cars and engines and so on. Songs will deal with almost every aspect of culture. And as we move into the late 50s and early 60s, songs will also express a lot of dissatisfaction with what is going on in American society and the American way of life. Well, as soon as World War II ended, the Soviet diplomats began to use America's racial discrimination as a propaganda tool. We're talking about they're arresting their own people and sending them to gulags or killing them or whatever they do to them. And so the Soviets turn around and say, well, look at what you're doing, segregating a whole group of people from the American way of life. And let's think about this. In the 1950s, you have separate facilities for blacks and whites. And what I mean by that is water fountains, restrooms, restaurants, hotels, travel on a train, public transportation, all sorts of facilities. Some had to sit in special places in movie theaters. Some had to be regulated to certain places in parks. Housing, unemployment, all of these things had racial overtones. I can remember as a young person growing up near Birmingham, Alabama, that when we would, quote, go downtown, seeing water fountains that said white only, or water fountains that said, in their terms, colored only. Knowing there were signs up at places, we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. And so the U.S. was a very racially discriminated world, in spite of all the surface prosperity and things that were going on. In Fayette County, Tennessee, during the 1950s, when blacks tried to vote, remember they'd supposedly had the right to vote since the end of the Civil War, most of them were sharecroppers, and they were evicted and forced to live in a tent city because they had tried to vote. And this was about 345 families. That's just an example. Just one county in the state of Tennessee. So what is the background of the civil rights movement? Well, number one, it is the destabilization of the racial system during World War II. Number two, massive black migration from the South and into the Democratic Party. Not the Southern Democrats, but the Democratic Party in general, that more liberal wing of the Democrats. Number three, the Cold War and the rise of independent third world states. Now, Eisenhower entered the White House committed to civil rights in principle, but he was limited by his own political philosophy to his commitment to civil racial equality. He preferred state and local action over federal involvement, and he figured this would be the better way to change laws and change attitudes. Now, under the Warren administration in the Supreme Court. And if you remember, Supreme Court is generally named for whoever is the Chief Justice. And under Warren's leadership from 53 to 69, the Supreme Court is going to become one of the most powerful forces for social and political change. Now, I want to teach you the civil rights movement in a very probably different manner than you've ever been taught before. The civil rights movement actually had 3 phases to it. The first phase is going to basically be through the court system. The second phase will be Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolent activism, especially in the Deep South. And the third phase will be following the murder of Dr. King and a more violent, radical form of civil rights movements that will occur in part because of Dr. King's death. So we're going to challenge schools. And to give you an idea how some of these lawsuits are going to come along, you have a little black child who lives on a particular side of the railroad track, and it would be simple and safe for her to go to the near white school. But because of separate but equal, she's forced to cross those railroad tracks and go a greater distance to go to a black school. And so a lawsuit is mounted over this. And as a result, it is going to be ruled that the idea of separate but equal, which was laid down in 1896, is wrong. And that black children should be allowed to enter the closer white public school. In fact, as Warren writes the decision the Supreme Court makes, he says separate but equal has no place in America. And so public policy is going to begin to change. And of course, as this happens, you're going to see some interesting scenes in Little Rock, Arkansas. They're going to block Central High School and mock black students as they begin to go. The governor of the state of Alabama will stand in the administration doorway of the University of Alabama to keep black students from entering. But more and more and more, it is going to happen. And the Supreme Court is going to be on the side of giving people the best education they can possibly get in, quite honestly, the nearest environment they can. And so Eisenhower is actually going to be forced to act on a civil rights bill in 1957. It will ensure that all Americans have the right to vote. But it will not have the teeth to enforce that. And so really no black voters will be added to the roll of voters in most of your southern states. Now, as things begin to change racially, you're going to have a lot of people in the South actually calling for the impeachment of the president. They think this is awful. And the government, including Eisenhower himself, from time to time, we'll have to call in military troops to help maintain peace. So understand, what we see in civil rights today was not an easy, smooth process. Imagine going to school and having to walk through a wall of people screaming racial slurs at you and having ugly comments to say about you and so on. Sometimes throwing things at you, being violent toward you, and such like. So some of these young people, quite honestly, were quite brave indeed, because they were changing things. And honestly, a lot of people don't like change. And to be very blunt with you, students, the first generation of change, that's the generation that has the most difficulty with these things taking place. And so it is going to be a very, very difficult time. A lot of people are going to go through some very, very hard times to bring about more rights for the African Americans in the United States. Now, we've already mentioned the formation of the NAACP. We will also have the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and this will be with Dr. Martin Luther King as the head of it. And notice something. In Dr. King's part of the civil rights movement, a whole lot of the activity is going to be coordinated through the church. Dr. King was a preacher. Many of the leaders of the civil rights movement will also be preachers. And Dr. King is going to borrow from a very famous world leader. His name was Mahatma Gandhi. And he practiced a form of nonviolent activism that helped ultimately India gain its independence from Great Britain. And Dr. King will take him as a model of who and what the civil rights movement should be, and he will advocate for his followers to practice this form of nonviolence. Now, let me say, because the demonstrators practice nonviolence does not mean that everybody around them practice the nonviolence. In Birmingham, Alabama, they will use water cannons, they will use nightsticks, they will turn dogs loose on demonstrators. And so there is going to be some tremendous suffering that goes on the part of many people. There are going to be civil rights leaders assassinated, including Dr. King himself. And so it is going to be a time of great upheaval and great, great difficulty. But Dr. King's assuming a leadership role will be a major shift in the movement. And we will go from relying on the court systems to we're going to take the battle, if you will, to the streets, and we're going to try to win the war of public opinion. Now, again, let me emphasize, students, this is not going to be a short, easy process. There are going to be many people who will suffer in many, many ways. But Dr. King realizes The way to change attitudes is not by a violent revolution as had taken place in the Soviet Union. The way to win was to win the battle of public opinion. And slowly and surely, Dr. King's methods are going to win more and more Americans over. Presidents are going to be slow in acting, but they will slowly, surely, and methodically begin to react and begin to respond to the civil rights movement. Now, quite honestly, I would normally prepare to go on, but I'd rather not begin the next section of the book, that is, and have to break it up. And so we'll go ahead and conclude class here for the day. And again, students, let me encourage you, please, 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 be safe and take care of yourselves.